Chapter 12, Mishnah 4. Since it is possible to sprinkle many Tamei people at the same time, as we learn at the end of Mishnah 2, it was common for there to be a public area where Tamei people would gather and have mei chatas sprinkled on all of them at once. The person sprinkling the mei chatas would stand inside a building and sprinkle from a window onto the people who passed below. The Mishnah discusses a case where someone was sprinkled and it turned out that the mei chatas used was not valid. The Mishnah will note an important difference in this regard between someone who was sprinkled in a public sprinkling, and someone who was sprinkled in a private sprinkling. If someone sprinkled mei chatas from a public window onto a Tamei person in order to make him tahor, and the person who was sprinkled then entered the Beis Hamikdash thinking he was tahor, and it was later discovered that the chatas water had not been valid at the time of the sprinkling, which means that the sprinkling did not make him tahor, and he entered the Beis Hamikdash in a state of tumah. The law is that he is not obligated to bring a korban for the sin of entering the Beis Hamikdash while tamei. Since it was a public sprinkling, he had a right to assume that the mei chatas that was used was valid, and that he was therefore permitted to enter the Beis Hamikdash. His entering in a state of tumah is therefore considered an unavoidable accident for which a person is not obligated to bring a korban. However, if the Tamei person was sprinkled from a private window, i.e. a window designated for private sprinklings, and he then entered the Beis Hamikdash, and it was then discovered that the chatas water had not been valid at the time of the sprinkling, he is obligated to bring a korban to atone for the sin of entering the Beis Hamikdash while tamei. Since it was a private sprinkling, he had no right to assume that the mei chatas was definitely valid, and he should have checked carefully before being sprinkled. Because he did not do so, his entering the Beis Hamikdash while tamei is considered to have been a somewhat avoidable mistake, shogeg, for which he must atone with a korban. The Mishnah notes an exception to this rule. However, if the person who was sprinkled was the Kohen Gadol, and he then entered the Beis Hamikdash, then whether he was sprinkled from a public window or from a private window, and the mei chatas was later found to have been invalid, he is not obligated to bring a korban for entering the Beis Hamikdash while tamei. This is because the Kohen Gadol is never obligated to bring a korban for entering the Beis Hamikdash while tamei. Having mentioned public sprinklings, the Mishnah teaches a law about places in which these sprinklings were done. There was so much mei chatas sprinkled during a public sprinkling that the ground would become soaked, and people would sometimes slip and fall in the puddles in front of a public window. Nevertheless, people who were tahor would step in the water and not refrain from doing so out of concern that they would become tamei from touching mei chatas. This is because the sages said, mei chatas that have accomplished the purpose of their mitzvah by being sprinkled on tamei people or utensils no longer transmit tumah.